So hello and welcome to the National Civic League's January Promising Practices webinar, Infusing Community Engagement and Equity into Your Charter. My name is Rebecca Trout and I'm the Program Director of the AllAmerica City Awards and Communications here at the National Civic League. For those of you less familiar with us, the National Civic League is a 125-year-old nonprofit and we aim to advance civic engagement to create more equitable and thriving communities. One of the programs that we do that with is through the AllAmerica City program. It is began in 1949 to advance outstanding examples of civic engagement in communities. We typically use this webinar series to uplift those promising practices from past AllAmerica City Award winners, but we also use it to promote resources and programs that we think would help with communities engagement work, which is today why we're focusing on the newly revised Model City Charter. But before we dive into that, I just wanted to give you a quick overview of this year's AllAmerica City Award. We're very excited to be partnering with our friends at the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. And as such, this year's theme is focused on housing as a platform to promote early school success and early learning recovery. You can find out more information about that theme, our award criteria, and some of the areas of focus by visiting our website. I'll also send you a link following today's webinar. The important information to remember today is that those applications are coming up and will be due soon on March 1st. So I encourage you to go ahead and start that application process and reach out, of course, if you have any questions. For today, we are excited to be focusing on our newly revised Model City Charter document. It has been a labor of love over the past year, and we have three members of those working group committees here to discuss the revision process, as well as the two main changes, equity and community engagement. So first up, we will be hearing from the National Civic League's president, Doug Linkhart, who will go over a little bit about the history of the Model City Charter and the catalyst behind this year's revision. Then we will be hearing from Benoit Jacob, Director of Community Development Institute with the University of Wisconsin at Madison, followed up by Wendy Willis, who is a National Civic League board member, as well as the Executive Director of the Deliberative Democracy Consortium. And then last but not least, we have Tom Carroll, who is the Village Manager of Silverton, Ohio. Before I hand it off to their capable hands, just a few small housekeeping items. You will notice that everyone is muted. We ask you to remain so throughout the duration of the webinar to cut back on any background noise. We will have an opportunity for you to use the raise hand feature as well as the chat feature to get your questions answered by our speakers at the very end of today's session, which is being recorded, and that recording as well as the slides will be emailed to you either later today or early tomorrow. And with that, I am happy to introduce the National Civic League's president, Doug Linkhart. Doug, can you get us started?
Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you all for joining us, and thanks especially to Benoit, Wendy, and Tom for helping us make this presentation. We're very proud of the Model City Charter, which has been around now for 120 years. It was first created back in 1900, 6 years after the Civic League was formed. And all of this was with an eye toward improving the integrity and effectiveness of local government. And we worked with the International City Managers Association and other organizations over time to improve the charter, focusing on the council manager system primarily as a way to professionalize city government and make sure that it's not partisan or corrupt like it was back in 1894 when we first started. And I'm glad to say that over the years, we've helped to maintain a level of trust at the local level that you don't see at the state and federal level. So thank you to all of you who helped make that happen. This 9th edition is 20 years in the making since the last edition, but we worked on it for the past year with a steering committee of 22 people from a number of different organizations, including the National League of Cities, ICMA, American Society of Public Administration, and other groups. And some of you may have been involved in that process, so thank you for that. The new model continues the emphasis on the council manager form of government and focuses on the city manager's role as a convener of conversations in the community and an implementer of policies made by a collective city council. We also talk about the mayor, the importance of a mayor being the policy leader and working with the council and the whole community to devise solutions to important challenges facing the community. We also have provisions on elections, calling for the direct election of mayors and a hybrid form of city council where possible, where you've got districts and at large, but this differs depending on the city, focusing especially on making sure that city councils are representative of every part of the community. And then most important, and what we're talking today about, is equity and engagement. These are principles that we would like to see added as major values of communities throughout the country. And for that reason, we're encouraging that they be expressed in city charters throughout the country as well. I do want to emphasize that many changes around equity and engagement can also be made in ordinance or resolutions or executive orders. Charters should be lean and not full of a lot of details. The principles should be in the charter, certainly, and some of our guests will talk about further details. But I do want to emphasize that there are other ways to improve racial equity and community engagement, especially by working with other groups in the community. So with that, I will hand it off to Benoit, I believe.
Thanks, Doug. And Benoit, if you wouldn't mind sharing your screen.
Is that shared now?
Yes.
Super, great. Well, thank you. First of all, thank you to Doug and Rebecca, the National Civic League, for inviting me to participate in this webinar. It's been a pleasure working with the group on revising the charter, and the year we spent talking about equity was informative for myself, and so I'm excited to have the chance to chat with you all further on this. So in my 10 minutes or so, I just want to start. I want to sort of hit three kind of big buckets. One is why equity, right? Why put equity in a charter? Once we have some agreement on there, where it ought to be in the charter, or where at least did we place it within the model city charter, and why? And then offer some thoughts on, for those who are thinking about revising their particular municipal charter, how you might go about, or some of the steps you might take towards that effort. Obviously, given the nature of this particular webinar, it's preaching to the choir a little bit, so the why might seem a bit obvious, but frankly, it's not, right? So I'm actually first and foremost a scholar of local governments, and so came about equity sort of subsequent to my work in local government more generally. And so the question of why is always sort of first and foremost the question I try to answer. And certainly when I approach municipalities or approach folks talking about equity, it's a question that comes up, right? Why do we need to deal with equity? Shouldn't this be tackled elsewhere, or ought it be somewhere else within a jurisdiction? And so the question here really is why equity at the local level, and then why equity in the municipal charter. And I think it's important to remind ourselves sort of what I read into sort of the dual goals of the charter. There's multiple goals, but certainly two broad objectives, one of which is to reflect the core guiding principles for organizing and operating municipal government. And then the other is to remember that even while we have these core and traditional values of best practices, the charter is also a living document, which is reflected in the 8 previous revisions. And so it's worth mentioning or worth describing how equity is both a core goal and, of course, how it reflects sort of the current trends of the day. I think equity traditionally, right, we think about the core values of municipal government as being efficiency, effectiveness, and economy, and that's been the guiding principles for past iterations of the charter. Increasingly over the last however many years, equity has come to the fore, certainly within the field of public administration, and the intellectual foundation for the charter, is represented or described as the fourth pillar of the field. And so increasingly it is recognized as a core value. And so it makes sense to include along those other three core principles of field. Obviously, it goes without saying, given the timing of this revision, that equity is one of the foremost issues of the day. And so while it's a core value, it's also one that is emerging as a key issue for local governments, municipalities to address. And we see many municipalities already starting to address equity in their programming. And so it made sense that both, given those two sort of dual, the fact that equity meets these kind of two dual goals of the charter, it makes sense to include it. So why equity? Because it is a core value of the field, and because it is an important issue guiding the current activities of local governments. The simple one. So when we put we're working with this working group to embed equity within the charter, we had lots of questions or lots of discussion about where it ought to be found in the charter, right? So one of the arguments or logic for where to place it in the charter is based on a fair bit of work many of us did in looking at local governments and how they're adopting equity. One of the things we find when you look at municipal governments and their adoption of equity programming is that it's not really in a central place. I mean, we find it in city managers' offices and sort of higher order levels within the public organization. But fundamentally, equity is about broad organizational change. And so this highlighted in the red here is one of the quotes that that I heard a lot in some of the studies I did, that when they think about implementing an equity program, they actually say, I think what we say is that equity isn't like an initiative or program. It's rather a fundamentally different way of doing work. And we see then that equity out of this is that equity is embedded throughout a municipal government, in a city manager's office, in an office of diversity, equity, and inclusion, in a planning office, in a housing office. We find it embedded throughout. And very often when folks talk about the successful implementation of equity, they talk about it as when equity programming will be embedded throughout the organization. So given that framework, our approach to revising the charter with an equity lens was to embed it throughout the charter, was to find places where the nature of the discussion within the charter clearly identified or made sense for equity to be part of that description. So we talked about it with respect to the city manager's office. We talked about it in places like land use planning and the objectives and efforts that a planning office has to go through. So similarly, I think the guidance here is that if you're embedding undertaking a change to your charter around equity, it makes sense to obviously have some sort of front-end preamble that introduces equity and the importance of it, but also that it ought to be embedded throughout that document. So the why, the where, and now the how, right? So how would you go about adopting equity into your charter? This to me is actually sort of obviously the part that's a little bit less certain. It's the most important question perhaps, but the one that's the trickiest to address. Because when you look at municipal governments, obviously there's a lot of variation in where the municipal organizations are in terms of their implementation of equity. And so the first question one has to ask themselves, if you are adopting equity in your charter, is really to have an honest conversation with where your municipality as an organization and as a jurisdiction is in terms of implementing equity. Frankly, revising the charter probably shouldn't be the first step, right? Equity is a big conversation that requires a lot of foundational work, and until that foundational work is completed, it probably wouldn't make a lot of sense to start with the revising of the charter. So just some things to consider then. First is, if you are going to start this foundational work, the first step in the foundational work is probably to develop a shared understanding of equity. In the revisions we made to the charter, we included an appendix, and in that appendix, we spent some time talking about various definitions of equity. Equity gets misconstrued with equality. It gets described in different ways. But having a shared understanding of what equity means, is it racial equity, is it social equity, and then what equity itself means, is going to be a critical part of the conversation that needs to be had before one talks about revisions to one's charter. Understanding if you're ready to even take that first step of why equity in your jurisdiction. So is there the shared sense of urgency of implementing equity in your jurisdiction? Certainly there's wide variation across municipalities. Some municipalities are open and excited and eager to undertake efforts for advancing equity. Others are not. And understanding what it's going to take to get your jurisdiction and your organization ready to adopt a significant change to your charter that includes equity is going to be critical. Understanding what infrastructure is available within your organization. So, like I said, a revision to your charter shouldn't be step one, because it's going to be critical that significant revision be attached to fairly fundamental changes in the operations of your municipal organization. Is the organization trained in adopting various equity tools? Do folks who use those tools have the skill sets required to effectively implement? Is an important challenge. So despite all the talk of readiness around, are you ready to adopt changes in equity? It's also at the same time important to balance the reality that you probably won't be 100% ready, and that adopting equity in the charter is going to be an important step for your jurisdiction, one that you want to make sure you have a strong foundation for, but your organization may not be 100% ready, and adopting equity into the charter may be the important step to get towards sort of full embeddedness within your organization. So I think I probably got right to 10 minutes or maybe hopefully within my time there. The big takeaways here, though, are sort of thinking about adopting equity in your charter is really a matter of thinking about the why equity ought to be in the charter, where you ought to include it in the charter, and then are you ready is really the question that helps you address the how can you go about adopting equity. So thank you for my time, and I'm looking forward to your questions, continued conversation.
Great, thank you so much, Benoit. As you mentioned, we'll take questions at the very end. So if you have any questions about the equity component of the presentation, feel free to either enter them into the chat right now or hold on to them until the end of the webinar. And now we are going to be joined by Wendy Willis, who was on the public participation working group. Wendy?
Thank you. Thanks, Rebecca and Doug. And I learned a lot from Benoit, as always. I'm glad to have been a part of that, to hear about the social equity work group as well. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the work that the public engagement work group did and where we landed. You know, public engagement and civic engagement has always been embedded in the work the Civic League does. And as a result, it's always been embedded in the Model City Charter, particularly the last version of it, but it was sort of off screen in a way, like it was happening, it was assumed. There were supplemental materials that you know, took public engagement really seriously, but at this time, the leadership of the Civic League really decided that public engagement should sort of come on screen and be directly addressed in the charter, in the Model City Charter, so as the fifth E, if we're talking about E's. So engagement is the one that follows equity this time, and in the introduction to in the preamble to the city charter entirely, public engagement is included, and then our work group took sort of the opposite approach as the equity work group did, which was rather than combing through the city charter and adding engagement at each point, decided to actually propose, which was accepted, a new article. So Article 7 is focused on public engagement entirely. And we found that as we started to look through the charter, it became kind of repetitive and long to talk about engagement at each point. So there's this is a place where a lot of the engagement thinking lands. So I think just to frame it up as we talked about this, recognizing that, equitable engagement and strong public engagement is really kind of the backbone to local democracy, and continues to increase the health of all the other aspects of local governance. And so that those things are sort of, in constant dialogue with each other. Right now, as I speak, there's a trash truck right outside my window. So thank you to the city of Portland, but I'm sorry about the trash sound that's coming through my window. So just to sort of walk you through the article just a little bit, just to sort of see what the structure is that the first part of the whatever you call it, the article, really focuses on public engagement as a piece of civic infrastructure. And so the recognition is that, we're trying to avoid kind of one-off public engagement efforts or piecemeal public engagement efforts. I know that probably many of you who do this kind of work regularly, keep going back out to the community, and you realize that people are crisscrossing each other, and a lot of the same people are being tapped all the time. And to recognize that civic infrastructure includes the city, obviously, but it also includes civic organizations, faith organizations, neighborhood associations, so that there's this whole sort of web of infrastructure in a city that is part of an engagement process, and sort of that the charter recognizes that the city is not always at the center of every single process, and that by connecting to those channels, both online and face-to-face, it sort of avoids some of the repetitiveness, some of the engagement fatigue, and also avoids just missing things missing communities that need to be part of really important parts of the conversation. The next part of the article kind of drills, I went past that, actually kind of drills down on what the city's structures are. So inside of that civic infrastructure, there are things that the city itself can build. And probably most of the cities here today have at least some version of some of these to help anchor ongoing engagement and ongoing equitable and deep continuing engagement. Council committees that include residents and stakeholders. I know that boards and commissions and committees are an important part of engagement. I know there's many cities that are actually using civic leadership academies and other kinds of leadership development programs to actually feed into committees and commissions. Of course, there can be administrative positions that are designed specifically for engagement, either at the the council level, at the legislative level, or at the bureau level as well. So recognizing what those administrative positions are that are devoted to engagement, and making sure that they're in conversation with each other, and that those seams are also tight. Commissions devoted specifically to public engagement. Many cities and counties have them, and they can be they can be really useful. And then community advisory boards, which I know many communities have adopted over the last few years, and they have their role, and they can be used to address the concerns of really specific populations and really specific communities inside the broader city. Youth commissions can be the leadership pipeline, can be a way to connect with youth, and can be quite fun actually. And then participatory budgeting and other commissions that deal with budgeting issues. So the city can build their own sort of nodes of engagement that then can go out and connect with the resources in the broader community. The final long set of conversations that we had in the work group, one of our work group members said it was like taking a graduate course in community engagement to be in these work group sessions every few weeks for a year. But we as Doug said, of course, charters are very, they're big picture, and that there's a lot of detail underneath of this. And so the principles of engagement became really important to kind of set out, and then cities can, implement those in whatever way makes sense for the particularities of their place. So equity, which Benoit talked about a lot, but equity and engagement has a lot of detail and a lot of texture to it, right? So making sure that people can participate in the way that makes sense for them and for their community, whether that be their language group, whether it be cultural practices, and really making sure that the city has means by which they can go to the community. Accountability, so if people give their time and effort to the city in order to participate and give input, that there's a way to communicate back to members of the community. Transparency, so that the efforts to reach out to communities are both obvious, and it doesn't seem like it seems like it's fairly applied. Accessibility, which is a close neighbor to equity, making sure that accessibility is broadly thought about, particularly as we think about more and more online engagement, that accessibility issues, they're in some ways you're gaining accessibility, and in some ways you're losing accessibility. So thinking about that both in person and online and what that means. Collaborative leadership between the city and the community, and then making sure that there's ongoing evaluation that goes on between at each process level. So finally, just, I think as we went through this process, and as we're doing practices in our own communities, we really see that equity and public engagement require each other. That in order to be an equitable community, there's, really deep and broad engagements necessary, and ongoing engagement. And similarly, in order to set the standards to do what Benoit is suggesting, which is, are we ready? What does equity mean in this community? Engagement's necessary for that process as well. And then, of course, implementation requires a lot of resources, just mostly intellectual resources in addition to financial resources. There's in the commentary to the Model City Charter, there's lists of resources one can find, that including a model ordinance to increase public engagement. There's also many university centers around the country that can help and be resources to cities, and so and the Civic League itself. So if as a city starting to undertake this and saying we really want to embed engagement into our DNA, as you think about what the implementation is, feel free to reach out to Doug or me or any of us, and we can talk about what resources are available to you around the country to sort of help bake that in a really practical way. So thanks so much we're so excited that we got to this point, and I look forward to further discussion with all of you.
Thank you, Wendy and Benoit, for kind of setting the table about those principles. We're now going to have Tom Carroll join us to give us a very specific kind of community example of how you embed equity and engagement into city principles and practices. Tom, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rebecca. My name is Tom Carroll, Village Manager in Silverton, Ohio. Let me confirm that all of you can see my screen and that I'm doing this effectively. Is that the case? Thank you. I see a thumbs up. So as a city manager, as an ICMA member, it was a real pleasure and honor to be invited to the National Civic League process of updating the charter. I got to work on the subcommittee with Benoit, which was a real pleasure. And one of the things that I've thought about as I've been giving some consideration to how stretched out city governments are around the country in their journey along addressing issues of equity, addressing levels of engagement, is that there's a good reason why we are so stretched out. It's because our cities are evolving rapidly, and I'm going to base some of this in some of the research that ICMA did around the changes in suburbs in the United States, and just throw out this amazing factoid from my perspective from a 2013 book by Elizabeth Kneebone and Alan Berube that in 2010, for the first time, there were more Americans living below the poverty line in suburban America than in big cities. So as I was doing some research for ICMA, I started realizing just how fundamental a shift we have experienced in our country in the last 2 decades. And I think these are only going to be accelerated by COVID. Communities that we once thought of as either working class or middle class suburbs are now dealing with more and more issues of poverty, dealing with issues of integration, changing demographics and diversity. And so what's surprising to me is that so many colleagues in city management, in local government, so many of our elected leaders, frankly, are a little stuck in recognizing how fundamental the shifts are and how seismic they are within many parts of the local government landscape. For example, one community near me had a poverty rate of 7% in 1999, and virtually imperceptible. Today, it's over 22%. So in a generation, it has experienced a pretty seismic shift where the community takes on this stronger sense of impoverishment. And so most of the people I think in this webinar agree and understand on the moral imperative for why equity and engagement are important, but not all of our colleagues in all of the other parts of the country do. And so what I'm offering is sort of in addition to the moral argument, which isn't always compelling to everybody, I'm offering just more of a factual argument that basically says equity is increasingly important in every part of the country, because communities across the country are starting to change in a way that requires us to look at issues of race, poverty, and fairness and equity. Sorry, real quick. I wanted to just discuss one of the things that I think about in terms of how stretched out cities are. And I work in a small city. Silverton's under 5,000 people. And I know there are a variety of people on this call from larger communities, some people who are chief equity officers. And I always have a bit of envy over my larger jurisdiction colleagues who have, I'm sure you're all under-resourced, don't misunderstand what I'm about to say, but you have enough capacity in the organization to have some division of labor. So that you can have a chief equity officer or somebody whose job it is to spearhead engagement. For many of jurisdictions of my size, we don't have that many employees, and so we don't have a chief equity officer or engagement officer. And this was part of the revelation for me through this process of working with the National Civic League on the model city charter is, in an organization like mine that doesn't have the resources for a chief equity officer, that I am the chief equity officer. And in fact, the city manager in the council manager form of government is in fact the chief equity officer, the chief engagement officer. That this entire process of adding equity and engagement into the charter is, as my colleagues on the panel have said, is fundamental to how we do business and how we set things up and operate. as a local government. And this requires us to braid it into everything that we do. And that requires the city manager to take a pivotal leadership and managerial role in making sure that that happens throughout the organization. And so I also offer this as a way of saying that when I've spoken to my smaller city colleagues, and myself perhaps included, whenever I have thought, well, wait a minute, I don't have the resources to have equity and engagement central to what I'm doing in 2022, that in fact that's mistaken. I just have a lot of other things on my plate, but I have equity and engagement fall to me as a city manager, and that this is a bit of a shift for ICMA members and city managers, because we have to recognize that this is just as important as any other job duty, perhaps more important. It's just like I am the safety director of the village of Silverton, I am also the chief equity officer. So that duty is one that I cannot avoid and should not avoid. The last thing that I wanted to share, when I think about city management and how we do effective, efficient, economical local government, I think we need to update our performance measurements. I'm sharing this excerpt from a 2021 housing plan that Silverton did. And Silverton has been near evenly split between Black and white residents for 40 or 50 years. Neighborliness, inclusion, diversity, these are words that people use to describe our community. But in the last 20 years, there has been a shift even in our community. And I wanted to draw your attention to this chart here. In 2000, 62% of Silverton's Black residents were homeowners. And today it's 43%. So in an almost 20-year period, in a generation, Silverton has gone from a stable, prosperous community with a solid Black middle class to a community where that's less so. And this is happening nationally. I'm not sure exactly, I don't have the data to know exactly what has caused all this. I think anecdotally, we know there's a generational shift, that we are becoming, I don't want to say gentrified, but we're having housing prices spike. And so all of a sudden, when a house that's owned by somebody who's older becomes available for sale, it's usually a white, young professional family that purchases it. And we also know that communities of color, particularly Black Americans, were disproportionately hit within this time frame by the predatory lending. But I offer this because Silverton has experienced, by many metrics that we would use in city government, we've been experiencing a bit of a renaissance, that we have been experiencing improvement, that we are proud of revitalization that is occurring. And yet at the same time, this graphic clearly shows that that's not being enjoyed by everybody, and that something fundamentally is broken. And so again, I go back to, even if you didn't believe the moral imperative that we should all be focused on engagement and equity in local government, I think this clearly shows the factual basis that the performance metrics that we use in local government need to place front and center equity and differences in terms of outcomes. And we therefore then, because of these different metrics, need to be looking at very different policy questions that as I explore making Silverton an anti-racist organization, that this requires a fundamental shift in what I spend my time on and what we as a local government try to achieve from a policy outcome. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Rebecca or Doug.
Great, thank you so much, Tom. So now we're going to open it up to some question and answers. The first question came in regards to Benoit's presentation. Benoit, you talked a lot about making sure that the model city charter was not likely going to be your first equity step, and that you needed to make sure you had a lot of resources and support in place. And Jerry's asking, how much support is enough? In a diverse democracy, there's not such thing as 100% support. So how do you know when you've kind of met that threshold and when you should go ahead and move forward with this effort?
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca, and thanks, Jerry, for the question. Jerry, I'm sure, oops, one second here. Sorry about that. Jerry is here in Wisconsin with me, and so I'm sure he's probably mostly sick of me hearing things like "it depends," but that's kind of where it'll probably lie. I'll defer this question primarily over to Tom, but let me take a little bit of this because I think he may have more experience with it. But let me just take a quick stab at it in kind of vague terms. So what a threshold is, and is going to be hard to say, right, when the precise number or what that actually looks like. It will vary by municipality. I mean, if there's one thing I've learned through a series of case studies I've done is that it's just the what implementation looks like from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Just it's going to vary quite widely. But you could imagine probably. So my interpretation of what would make a reasonable time for a charter to be revised, part of that would be having actionable sorts of equity efforts ready or already engaged within your organization. And that may sound a little counterintuitive, that might sound a little backwards, but the reason being that a lot of folks push back on the idea of changing the big vision documents, changing the big guiding documents, and then having to wait a tremendously long time in order to take action. And so having some sort of relationship between these guiding documents and clear, tangible action, I think is really critical to equity, because it can be super frustrating for those groups that are disenfranchised to see big changes in vision and not many changes in street level kind of actions. So that's kind of the guiding principle I would use. What that looks like as a threshold is a little bit hard to say. Tom, you being probably closer to the ground on this, you might have some more ideas than myself.
Yeah, I don't know that I have, there's no one answer or silver bullet, Benoit, but I guess if the question is how and when do you advance equity as incorporating that into your charter? So Silverton hasn't updated our charter in over a decade. And so we're probably going to do that in the next 2 or 3 years. And there's not a specific time frame or requirement in our charter that we amended every handful of years. We have an existing charter review committee. But until there's some other probably more business reason why we want to amend our charter, we probably won't be examining the model charter specifically on engagement and equity. But if the question is how do you advance equity either in the charter or in general when there's not 100% support for it doing so, I think my response would be when it's 1% support for it, you advance it because it's the right thing to do. I think the National Civic League and ICMA and many of the related organizations recognize in 2022 that the time to have a fulsome examination of local government's role in structural racism, in inequity, in inequality is overdue. And so the answer I would offer is the time to do it is 2 years ago, 20 years ago, or tomorrow, if you're waiting. I say that who hasn't really advanced, who is still learning a lot and advancing in building the airplane as we fly.
I think Jerry raises a very interesting question, and I was in elected office for 18 years, and that was always the critical question: is when do you jump? And I think depends on where you stand, of course, or where you stand depends on where you sit. If you're a city manager, obviously you're looking to your elected officials to see where they are and trying to engage the full community to gauge the community sentiment. I think we forget to do that sometimes. We hole ourselves up in City Hall and try to decide what we think is right without, seeking out stakeholders, partners in the community. United Way, for example, has a very strong stance around racial equity. Local universities, school districts are important to include as well. So I think it's a balance between community support, pushback, and principle. And of course, as a city manager, you generally want to keep your job. So you have to balance carefully. I agree with Tom that principle is very important, especially regarding race and racial equity. And I think that will come out in community conversations, even though there will be those loud naysayers that will stand up from time to time.
Can I I'll just add one other thing, just as a quick digression. I'm happy that the answers to Jerry, all from other people as well, also sort of hovered around it depends. So it's not just me, Jerry, other folks, it'll also, that's the answer you'll get from other folks as well.
Great, thank you. Okay, I have another question here, and this is pretty community specific, and it's for Wendy. And the question is, there's a November ad in this individual city who's searching for candidates for a charter review commission. The city bypassed several highly qualified individuals and filled a spot with a zoning officer. And the question is this legal, or is this difficult for public participation? So Wendy, I will throw that one to you.
Yeah, I think charter review commissions are only as good as they are, right? So I think charter review commissions can be really effective ways to have community voice in those kinds of decisions, but they also can be a little insidery and cronyistic. And so I don't know about the details of this particular charter review commission, but one of the things that I hope that the Civic League we can talk about as we sort of go forward using the Model City Charter are some ways in which you can embed really robust public engagement processes into those charter review commissions. And so either by making sure that there's a sort of intricate call and response between public input into those processes that's really transparent and really widespread and really deep, or to do things like a sortition process where the commission is actually randomly selected in the community, demographically balanced so that the community is highly represented. There's all sorts of things that that a city can do if a commission is either required by law or is the preference of the council. So I think that there are practices one can build around it, but I think there are examples both ways, I would say.
Thank you for that. Right, our next question is back on the equity topic, and it is, what are the ways that cities can promote equity in home loan processes? Either Tom or Benoit have any responses to that one?
Quick response is I'm figuring that out. I don't know. I don't have the magic bullet. I think what we're starting to do is explore partnerships. We're starting to recognize the changing nature of the housing market in our community. Of particular interest to me is that many homes that were formerly available for single family homes purchase that were foreclosed upon in the Great Recession are now owned by out-of-state Wall Street banks and hedge funds and are available only for rent, and that contributes to our affordable housing crisis. And so I'm starting to understand that policy issue. a little better. And then we're trying to figure out what regulations we should do on those landlords, and then try and find banks and other nonprofit partners who will help our community members achieve homeownership.
Thank you, Tom. Right, and this one again is for Wendy, and it's about your hometown here in Portland. And the question is, how is the Portland, Oregon Charter Commission considering opportunities to introduce equity and community engagement language since they are undergoing a revision themselves? Do you have any insight into that, Wendy?
I'm going to flip that to Paul himself, my buddy Paul, who asked the question. He probably is much closer to that Charter Review Commission than I am. So I don't know what's going to happen there. So Paul, if you have any tea, share it with us.
I asked it partly to see whether I sent the notice of the new language you guys have all developed and this webinar to the Charter Commission. But the staff person thanked me for that, but I'm not sure how aware they are of this great work that you've been doing. And this is a huge issue here. So here's a great test case to see if we can use all this good work that you've done with an active group that actually cares a lot about these issues to try to see if we can get something in there. So maybe you and Wendy, you and I can talk a little offline and try to see if there's an opportunity for us to at least share this wonderful webinar. I mean, it's been great with them, or if we can personally reach out and talk with different commission members. So again, I just think this is great work, and it's a matter of how do we get it into the hands of people who are actively trying to push this kind of stuff forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. The revolution starts here. You all heard it. Thanks.
Yes, thanks, Paul. I do know they're aware of the Model City Charter revision. I think we spoke to some members of the review commission, but we're always looking for ways to get this information into the hands that need it.
And out into the community. And so I was just talking with a group of community neighborhood activists just before this webinar, and they're very interested. So I think the more we can get the community to be aware of your good work, the more sort of pressure there'll be from inside and outside to address this in a positive way. Thanks.
Thank you. All right, our next question is from Craig, and he's wondering how you respond to or handle city officials that seem to have contempt for the idea of public engagement, and how you kind of sell the idea to those that might not be super interested.
I'll take the first. I'm sure we all have thoughts about this. I think, this is it's an ongoing issue, but I also think you can design your way out of this problem to some extent, so that if you can create a situation that's not just a call and response between an elected official on a dais and somebody in a testimony situation, this dynamic can get broken up a little bit. There's a few years ago, there was a great piece written around this model ordinance that I mentioned earlier that talks about, beyond the 3 minutes at the microphone model, so that the conversation doesn't necessarily happen between one individual person and the elected official, but actually as a deliberative process among members of the community, that the elected official is in some sense a participant in, or even just an observer of, so that input can be received. Now, I hear what you're saying, that no matter how great the design is, it's possible that elected officials won't hear it. But the more the expectation in the community is that the voice matters, that my voice matters, the voice of my neighbors matter, the less likely they are to continue to be these sort of long-serving member of council. So I'd be interested to hear what others have to say about that.
I know this is difficult, and we often hear from public officials who are like, why would we want more of what we don't already like? You know, the NIMBYs and the loudmouths that come to city council and, you know, disrupt meetings, and why do we want more of that? You know, we try to encourage folks to understand that we're reaching out to what they might call the silent majority, a term that I don't use very often, but it's, you know, there are folks that we don't hear from, and we want to get them at the table. And I think, you know, one way to approach an elected official who doesn't like the folks who are making all the noise and doesn't like engagement in general is to ask, who do they listen to? What kinds of folks would they like to get at the table? Because clearly they must be missing.
Thanks, Doug. I think the last question we will have time for is how much should all of this be cast in stone? Should these principles go into a charter or be more flexible, and what does that look like? Leave that up to any of our panelists.
Well, I'll take a quick stab at it, I guess. I mean, in terms of equity, again, I think, I mean, cast in stone is an interesting, you know, sort of, I don't know that I've ever thought of the charter as cast in stone, but, you know, if the idea is that we have a charter that is supposed to represent and reflect guiding principles, then clearly equity and engagement, I think, are increasingly recognized intellectually and practically as guiding principles of local government operations. And so it makes sense, right, as a foundational piece to be included. In fact, it would seem quite no mission to not include those, given how they are understood as part of the broader canon of work in local government.
Benoy or Wendy, any closing thoughts either about that last question on whether or not these principles should be in the charter itself or be more flexible, or just any sort of parting thoughts in general?
Well, just to follow up on Benoy for 1 second, certainly in this public participation or the public engagement subcommittee, we talked a lot about, there's always some hot practice that's, you know, that's being developed that places are using around the country and around the world. And we really tried to avoid codifying particular practices for the exact reason that you're mentioning, and rather tried to focus on principles that could be applying across practices. Because if, you know, as Tom says, if you're only revising your charter every 10, 20, 30 years, in some cases, then you don't want to have these kind of dated practices be to be in your charter. So I think that certainly is, you know, it's a consideration.
Thanks, Wendy. All right, well, that is the end of our time. I want to thank you all for spending this hour with us. A special thank you to Doug, Wendy, Benoy, and Tom for sharing their expertise and also, of course, their time on these working groups. It was a long process, and we're really happy with the final product. As I mentioned, the recording and slides will be emailed to you later today. If you have any questions that weren't addressed, feel free to respond to that email and we'll see if we can't get those answered. As one of the presenters mentioned, we also have a number of resources available to you, and I'll send that resource link in that follow-up email. And with that, please enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll hope to see you in a future webinar.